This session is on 10 things in Active Directory that can hurt your application and desktop virtualization efforts and how to fix them. My name is Webster. I'm kind of like Prince, Madonna, Sting, Bono. All I need is just, the one name. So I'm just Webster, and if you can't tell from my accent, I'm pert near based out of Nashville, Tennessee. I'm an independent consultant. I basically do three things. I do Citrix, XenApp, PVS is essentially all I do, Active Directory, and I do a little bit of writing. I've been a Citrix technology professional since 2010, and I've been working with Citrix products since the very first product was released way back in 1990. I run the website carlwebster.com, the accidental Citrix admin, for those who find themselves supporting Citrix accidentally or involuntarily. Here's my email address. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And as you can tell, with all the Carl Websters, I make myself pretty darn hard to find on the internet. Now, before we continue, so you're not scrambling around trying to copy down all the URLs and all the times and all the sequences of events and all the stuff we're going to be talking about, I got a PDF, free PDF, be available on my website as soon as this session is over. All my slide notes, all my research, lots of extra information on Server 2012 and Active Directory stuff is all in the slide notes. All that stuff is in there. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be covering domain and force functional levels, global catalog, connection objects, subnets, reverse DNS lookup zones, duplicate DNS entries, Orphan domain controllers, authoritative time server, domain controller DNS IP configuration settings, and Active Directory design guidelines. Now about these 10 things, there are a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings about these 10 things. So what I've done is I did my presentation and then I sent it off to several Active Directory MVPs and directory services experts and had them review everything to make sure that all the information you are getting here is accurate and up to date. Because if you want to, we can play the battle of KB articles and TechNet articles. And a lot of the information that people say I'm wrong, you go and look, and they're referring to a TechNet article that was written in 1999 when Active Directory was first being designed. Microsoft has kind of changed the way they tell you to implement Active Directory since 1999. Now, I've been around Active Directory since July 2001, and in that time, I've done around 100 Active Directory migrations and assessments. So the information you're fixing to get here is not based on the fact that I read Brian Desmond's Active Directory book, or I've read some Microsoft support articles, or I've buried my head in TechNet. Now, this is me out in the field, fixing Active Directory issues, helping people do migrations, and implement XenApp, XenDesktop, View, PVS, and stuff like that. And these are the common issues that I find. There are about 50 issues that I look for, but Brian, unfortunately, did not give me a 12-hour session time, so we can only cover these 10. The first thing I want to look for when I go to a site is I want to look for their domain and force functional levels. So why am I looking for this? Because most people leave stuff at the defaults, they install everything, and they never change anything. A lot of that is based on fear, and most fear comes from lack of knowledge. And when you actually learn about something, you realize that you can get off of these default domain and force functional levels. Another reason this is bad is because by leaving things at the default, you're not able to take advantage of enhancements to replication topology, to replication, to enhancements to Active Directory security. So for a new 2003 domain, the defaults are Windows 2000 Mixed and Windows 2000. Now, the reason this is bad is because if you go up to the 2003 level, Microsoft has made enhancements to how the replication topology is generated, how replication is done, and then the most important thing in our world of virtualization is this thing called linked value replication. At the 2000 level, a group can only consist of about 5,000 objects. And for most groups in our world, that's just not enough members. And the other thing that this is important for is if you're at 2000 and you go and make a change, say you either add a member to a group or you remove a member from the group. If you've got 5,000 users in that group, you've got that big old ostrich egg replicating to all your domain controllers. If you go up to 2003, you have linked value replication, which means if all I do is change a girl's name because she got married, the only thing that gets replicated around your network is the name change, not the entire group. The other reason this is an advantage is, let's take an example. We're going to remove 50 users from a group and add 50 users to a group. And we're going to split that across 4 help desk people, 4 admins. And each one's going to add 25, one's going to add 25, one's going to remove 25, one's going to remove 25. And as an example, say they all hit a different domain controller. So we got 4 different domain controllers. How are you going to reconcile all those adds and removes from 4 different domain controllers? If you're still on this level, you're going to be in a world of hurt. It's not very efficient and it's not done very well. If you move up to 2003, piece of cake. No problem with that. A brand new, before I forget, these domain force functional levels, those are the minimum required to support a 2003 domain controller. And then when we go to 2008 and 2008 R2 for a new domain forest, the default is server 2003. Again, that's the minimum level necessary to support a 2008 or an R2 domain controller. When I see this, that means that people are not able to take advantage of things like Kerberos using AES 256 encryption or fine-grained password policies, or if you go up to 2008 R2, the Active Directory recycle bin. And what about the brand new 2012? Microsoft got smart. The new defaults are the maximum level. Where in 2003, 2008, and R2, they did things at the minimum level. And why is that a problem? Because most people never change them. They're still running around in 2012 in a 2003 domain with everything set at the 2000 level. It's not a good thing. So Microsoft said, we'll change that. If you're going to create a new 2012 environment, you're going to go up to the maximum level. And by being at the maximum level, you're automatically taking advantage of AES 256 encryption for Kerberos. You're automatically using DFSR for sysvol replication. Nice enhancements. Now, for those who haven't had a chance to play with Server 2012, in the PDF, what I've done because I have no life is I've gone through all the various scenarios, adding a 2012 domain controller to my 2003 environment, to my 2008 lab, to my 2008 R2 lab, using all the defaults. And I've got screenshots of all the errors, all the warnings, because DC Promo no longer exists. It's now a different process. AD Prep no longer has to be manually done. It's all part of the new promotion process. Everything can now be done via PowerShell, and you can now save all the PowerShell scripts. So what I did, by taking all the options, I've saved all the PowerShell scripts. All the PowerShell scripts are in the PDF that you can get. Are there any questions on domain and force functional levels? The one reason people don't get off of these is because of one key misunderstanding. If I'm at 2008 and I raise my domain and force functional level to 2008, the misunderstanding is that, well, I can never add a 2003 or 2000 server to the environment. That's not true. The domain and force functional level just deals with the highest level of domain controller, or the lowest level of domain controller that you can implement. So if I'm in a 2008 environment, I raise my DFL and FFL to 2008. I can't implement a 2003 domain controller, but I can sure as heck implement a 2003 file server or 2003 R2 file server. It doesn't keep you from doing that. The next thing I want to look for is the global catalog. Now, in our environment, one of our key jobs is we need to provide a good logon experience for our users. And the global catalog is one of the areas that is key to providing our users with an optimal logon experience. So what is the global catalog? Microsoft has a very nice article, and the global catalog is basically a distributed data repository that contains a searchable partial representation of every object in an AD forest. Now, if you're in something like a Boeing or Citibank or something, you've got a huge AD forest. Every global catalog server in your environment contains a partial representation of every object in your AD forest. And it's in memory, which means that these domain controllers that have 1 gig and 2 gig of RAM are more than likely affecting your user's logon experience. So what does the global catalog do in the logon process? Well, we'll cover this in more detail a little later, but when a domain user logs on interactively to a domain, the contacted or authenticating domain controller must retrieve information from a global catalog server under the following 2 conditions. If the DFL is Windows 2000 or higher, you can use universal groups. If you use universal groups, a person could be in a group for an object that's in a different domain. Also, the user can log in using a UPN. A UPN is if my domain is amalgamatedcorporated.incorporated.com. I don't want my users having to type that in all the time. So I can shorten that to corp or ACI. If I use something like ACI and I log in as Webster at ACI.com, ACI has absolutely nothing to do with my Active Directory environment. So it has to go to a global catalog server to retrieve the actual domain that it's supposed to use to validate my credentials. So Webster's rule, bottom line, configure all domain controllers as global catalog servers. What does Microsoft say? Microsoft has a very nice article that explains how the global catalog works, and in their bad English and everything, it is recommended make all domain controllers be global catalog servers. Now, some of you are probably thinking, Webster, you're forgetting something. What about the infrastructure master? Because everyone knows that the domain controller that hosts the infrastructure FSMO row cannot be a global catalog server. Bunk. That's old news. What's the infrastructure master do? The infrastructure master updates cross-domain references in phantoms from the global catalog, and a phantom is essentially how Active Directory deals with deleted objects. So if we are in a single domain environment, we don't have any cross-domain references or phantom objects. So the infrastructure master has absolutely nothing to do. So you can make your infrastructure master a global catalog server. If we're in a multi-domain environment, if we make every global catalog server, every domain controller a global catalog server, there we go, infrastructure master has absolutely nothing to do, which is a good thing, because we don't want it keeping track of all the stuff from everywhere. So it's a good thing. Are there situations where you would not want a domain controller to be a global catalog server? Because a global catalog server is extra data that has to be replicated in your environment. There are times when you may not want to do that. That's if you've got a highly congested or a weak WAN link to a remote site, and you may not want all that replication traffic. Let's think about that. So if I've got a domain controller that's not a global catalog server, and I've got users over there, and they're using that domain controller to authenticate, if I've got a Windows 2000 or higher DFL in a multi-domain environment, and I'm using universal groups and or I'm using UPNs, that domain controller's got to go somewhere to find a global catalog server. So it's got to go out over that weak or highly congested WAN link to go find a global catalog server, get the information, and bring it all the way back over across our highly congested weak WAN link so that user can authenticate. That's fine if you've only got one user in that site. What if you've got tens or hundreds of thousands of users on that site? Are we impacting their logon experience? Oh yeah. You got other issues that you need to resolve. All right? Now, if we want to find all of our domain controllers that are not global catalog servers, we can use PowerShell. And this will give us all our global catalog servers all of our domain controllers that are not global catalog servers. If you've got multiple sites, if you add the site name here, it'll give you a list, you'll know what site. Now, if you've only got a few, it's actually easiest just to take that site, go into Active Directory Sites and Services, go to that site, expand the server, go to NTDS settings, right-click, Properties, select the Global Catalog box, click OK, you're done. If you've got a lot, well, I did find a PowerShell script that would actually automate this process, but unfortunately, the lines are like this long, and in order to get everything to fit on what you could see, I had to wrap everything, and it was like 6-point font, and you wouldn't have been able to read it anyway. So it's in the PDF. So thanks to Laura Hunter and Robbie Allen for that. And then I worked with my friend and Exchange MVP, Michael B. Smith, and he showed me how to take their thing that did one domain controller, make it a global catalog server, and make it an actual PowerShell script that would then process all domain controllers in a domain. Any question on the global catalog? Next thing I want to look for are connection objects. Specifically, I'm looking for manually created connection objects. Manually created connection objects are bad because you're short-circuiting the Active Directory process that goes out and creates connection objects. So what should be there? What I'm looking for, I want to make sure that everything says automatically generated unless you're also using read-only domain controllers. So for 2008 and R2, you'll have RODC connection FRS. For server 2012, it will say RODC connection sysvol. Now, I'm taking this to be because my 2008 and R2 labs, everything was at the default. So the DFL was 2003, FFL was 2003, so it was not able to use DFSR for sysvol replication. My 2012, I took the defaults, which was the DFL, FFL of 2012, which automatically used DFSR for sysvol replication. So I actually had a little bit of life, or else I would have created another set of labs, but I'm assuming that if I upped my 2008 and R2 labs to use DFSR for sysvol, I'm assuming that that RODC connection would also say sysvol for there. So why are manual connection objects there? Because most admins have no idea how the Active Directory Knowledge Consistency Checker, or KCC, works. If you suffer from insomnia, or you ever just want to do something that will absolutely knock you out without having to go to the doctor and get a knockout shot, Microsoft has an extremely detailed article on how all of this works. You can read that, it'll keep you busy for hours, but you'll probably be asleep within 15 minutes. So how does the KCC build connections between domain controllers? Well, the KCC is just a DLL that resides on every domain controller. Every DC is independent. So every KCC on each DC is independent. The KCC looks in the configuration container, and it knows all the information about every domain controller in its domain. So all KCCs running independently on each domain controller all have the same information. And they're going to go out there and build a replication topology. And the neat thing is, because they all have access to the exact same information, and they all are running the exact same software with the exact same set of algorithms, they all independently will come up with the exact same replication topology. Now, bit of trivia here, rhetorical question. When does a domain controller officially become a domain controller? Only when the sysvol share is created. When is the sysvol share created? Once all the contents of sysvol are replicated over to the new to-be domain controller, only then is sysvol share created, only then is it officially a domain controller, and only then will the KCC kick off. So one of the problems I see is that companies will have hundreds or thousands. I've been in one environment where they had almost 4,000 group policy objects. And the admin was trying to add a new domain controller. DC promo, look at the thing, immediately log in. Crap, it's not in sites and services. Goes to the command prompt, net share. Ah, crap, sysvol's not there. Okay, I've done something wrong, something's wrong. DC promo removes it down, reboots, checks stuff, go, I can't find anything wrong. DC promo comes back up. He says, I'll wait. Waits an hour. Checks. Crap, it's still not in sites and services. Crap, still don't have sysvol. I've done something wrong. DC promos it down. DC promos it back up. I'll wait 2 hours. Still not there. DC promo down. DC promo up. Now, what we found out is when we went and looked at the actual sysvol folder, is that there were almost 16,000 files and folders out there. Took a while to replicate that stuff over. Took 6 hours for all that stuff to replicate over. And only until that very last GPT.ini file is actually all the way over and everything's validated, then sysvol share is created. Then it says, you'll look in your logs and you'll see, sysvol has now been created. I am no longer preventing this server from becoming a domain controller. It's now a domain controller. Now KCC will run. So now we reboot a server. We get to the Control-Alt-Delete screen. When we get to that screen, 5 minutes later, KCC will run. 15 minutes later, and every 15 minutes after that, the KCC will run. So if we're adding a new domain controller into the environment, the first time it runs, it doesn't have any idea about replication topology, or it doesn't have all that information. So we've got a catch-22 here. We don't have the replication topology necessary to replicate, but we have to have the replication topology to replicate the replication topology. So what's going to happen is it's going to overcompensate. It's going to say, I'm going to pull from this domain controller and this domain controller and this domain controller and this domain controller. And then eventually it'll go, oh, you know what? I really don't need this one and I don't need this one. All I need are these two here, and then it will do away with those. So what you need to do when you're bringing up a new domain controller, wait until it actually becomes a domain controller and you got the sysvol share. It reboots the server, and then when it gets to the Control-Alt-Delete logon screen, just wait. I say wait 35 minutes because that gives the 5-minute interval, the first 15-minute interval where it's probably sitting there creating and breaking down connections. Then by the third time KCC is run, it should have settled down and you'll be able to actually have something you can look at in sites and services. So now I know I have no life. All my kids are grown and gone. So what I did is I actually created a 7-domain controller 2003 lab, a 7-domain controller 2008 lab where the 7th domain controller was a read-only domain controller. I created a 7 lab 2008 R2 domain controllers with the 7th one being a read-only domain controller. And then I created another lab with Server 2012 with 7 domain controllers, with the 7th one being a read-only domain controller. So I actually ran all this stuff through all 4 sets of labs over many days and stuff. And what I found neat was that for 2003, 2008, 2008 R2, I would bring up the first domain controller because it has all the FSMO rows and it's my primary DNS server, that's what everyone points to. I'd bring up DC1. And then I would bring up any of the other domain controllers in any order. Sometimes I would just highlight them all and just say start them all. And then I would sit there and just wait like an hour. And then every time, the exact same replication topology was generated for all 3 labs. And so I was able to grab screenshots. So obviously when you bring up one domain controller, there's no one to talk to. When I bring up 2 domain controllers, obviously they're going to talk to each other. Bring up 3 domain controllers, it's 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 1. And that's the way I thought it would be all throughout. I thought, you know what, it would always just be 1 goes to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 1. Nah, didn't work that way at all. But then I found out that, well, actually, the KCC actually has 3 goals. The first goal is no domain controller in a site will be more than 3 hops away from any other domain controller. Within a site, KCC generates replication topology geared for speed. Intersite replication is geared towards saving bandwidth. So with those 3 things in mind, all right, it's a little bit more understandable. So then when I got to 4 domain controllers, I noticed that, well, 1 went to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 3, 3 to 1. Now, replication topology is pull. Replication is never push. So if I'm looking at here, I'm showing that DC1 is pulling from DC3, and DC3 is going to pull from DC1. Replication topology is not full mesh. And this is one of the reasons people create manually created connection objects, because they're going like, ah, crap, 2's not pulling from 3, 3's not pulling from 2, and 4 and 1, and 1 and 4. Oh, I need to create some objects in here because replications, it's not right. No, every domain controller in here is within 3 hops. Then when you go to 5, then what I had to do here is I had to start rearranging stuff so that I don't get all kinds of cross lines, because cross lines are really hard, to see on a PowerPoint. But you can see I can't find the rhyme or reason, but you can pick any domain controller and look at any other domain controller, and they're all within 3 hops. No domain controller. And the same thing when I go to 6. And then when I add 7, now 7 is my read-only domain controller. A read-only domain controller is read-only. It doesn't have any updates. It can't update anything, so no one pulls from a read-only domain controller. So I'm saying this to say that this was exactly the same every time for 2003, 2008, 2008 R2. Yeah, what about the other lab I had? So I'm thinking, man, it's, So I emailed someone who does stuff with Active Directory a lot and said, I'm kind of curious here. It's not the same. And I said, it's just a bug or my misunderstanding. Of course, we all know there's no bugs in any Microsoft software. And so actually last night, I got an email from this individual saying that, the directory services team is confused and quite nervous. Would you not say anything publicly about what you have found? Of course, I'm not an MVP. I'm not beholden to Microsoft. So I'm not saying anything about that server operating system that supposedly is going to be released in October of this year. But would you like to see what I found, the replication topology generated in Server 2012? You see all my nice pretty pictures of all the replication. All the other stuff was 2003, 2008, 2008 R2 is exactly the same every time, no matter what order I brought up the domain controllers. It was always the same, always, every time. Okay, I didn't say anything publicly. Any question, other than this server operating system, are there any stuff about connection objects, KCC? Yes?
In multiple client sites, it takes a long time for a domain controller to come up sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
What causes that?
At some customer sites, some domain controllers take a long time to come up. I have the exact same problem in one of my labs because of the hypervisor I'm using. Every time I boot up the server, I get new NICs every time, which then causes my domain controller VMs to come up and say, oh, these are new NICs, they're public. And they're public until after it's set there for 30, 45 minutes, and all of a sudden it goes, oh, yeah, I recognize these. These are carlwebster.com NICs. And boom, all of a sudden now DNS will now come up. Group policy will now do its thing. KCC will now do its thing. Sysvol will now do its thing. It takes a little while. And usually I find that is a NIC issue. Any other questions?
Yes. Basically, you were saying about when you have like your servers, you know, like in our own environment, you have some in a mesh, and you have, let's say, one site that just connects to a particular server before it goes down. Would that be an instance where you want to manually create the connection?
Nope.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, repeat the question. 2 sites? Or are you talking 2 sites? And we got a server from over here? Are we talking AD sites or just physical sites?
They are physical and also AD sites. Separate.
Okay, all right, separate AD sites. And you want to come over here and it's not working right and it's at a good time to create a manual connection object. No, it's never a good time to create a manual connection object. When you create manual connection objects, you're short-circuiting KCC. You're telling Active Directory and KCC, I'm smarter than you are. If something is not being created, you have not given sites and services enough information about your infrastructure for it to create the proper connection objects. KCC knows absolutely nothing about your LAN or WAN. You have to go in there and you have to create your subnets. You create sites, assign them to your subnets, give costs to the site links and stuff, and it will then use that information to create all the connection objects. If you think something is broken, more than likely it's you that's broken because you haven't given KCC all the information necessary to create the connection objects. So you need to go in there and make sure, and we're going to fix and talk about this, you need to make sure you got all your subnets, your sites associated with subnets, give your sites the proper cost, because it knows nothing. It doesn't know how anything is connected in your environment. There was one gentleman in the back that had a question.
Multiple sites, multiple DCs,
Ooh.
subnets. When you bring up the NTC, are you saying that if it's in 10 domains, but it's all one company and everything, but it's just 10 different sites, are they all supposed to be showing in the NTC, or domain 1 only shows 1 or 2, domain 2 will show 1 or 2?
Right.
They don't have, they're not going to be the same in all, correct?
That is correct. The question was if I've got 10 domains and I'm looking in sites and services and I'm looking at the connection objects, each domain will have, correct, that is correct. Each domain will have its own replication topology because I'm only replicating within a domain because I'm replicating the domain context, not.
You make one of the domains or one of the domain controllers or global catalog a primary, so that way everybody gets it from there. Because most of them are 2003, only the 2 or 3 domain location are 2008, which I
You don't. Now, one of the nice things in 2012, when you go through the promotion process, you can actually now pick which domain controller you want all that initial replication to come from. That's a nice thing in 2012. And someone else had a question?
I did. If you have multiple sites, but you have no DCs at the sites, do you recommend creating subnets in sites and services?
I recommend, the question was, if you have multiple sites and you don't have domain controllers in that site, do you recommend creating subnets for those sites? I recommend that those sites not even be there.
Yeah.
What purpose are they serving?
Exactly.
All right, well, I was going to cover this in another slide, but sites have only to deal with replication. They have nothing to deal with permissions or security or anything other than replication. And you can apply, if you're dumb enough to, you can apply group policy to sites.
So in a multi-branch environment where there's only a few users at each of the branches, and I have no AD boxes, no DCs at those, so I'm just going to have one site and it's going to be the head office.
That's where they're all going for their domain controllers anyway.
Okay.
Okay. His thing was, if he's got all these multiple sites, no domain controllers, well, actually, there's no reason to have the sites, because in the process which we're fixing to cover, when a user logs on, they're going to be sent to that domain controller in that main site, because that's the only domain controller. So what's the purpose of having all the sites? Just cluttering up sites and services. To me, I say delete them all. And I'm working with a customer right now that has probably 100-something sites that I'm telling them they need to delete 99 of them.
You said earlier, if there's manually created connection objects there, you say delete them?
Delete them. Now, I did have one case back in early May, late April. When I went in, replication was just broken. DNS was just not working. And what we found out when I went in and looked in sites and services, everything was a manual created object. So there was nothing automatically created. No one was around from whoever designed all of that and did all of that. So my thing was, delete everything. I was like, if you're that scared, document all those manual objects and then delete them. So finally they did. They went and deleted every manual connection object. Within 15 seconds, KCC had gone out and done its thing. And within an hour, replication had settled down. Replication was working. DNS was replicating. DNS was working. It was all because they thought they were smarter than Active Directory. You're not, none of us are smarter than Active Directory. So don't try to outsmart it. Don't try to outthink it. You know. Any other, yes?
Yeah, just a follow-up question. So with manually created connection objects, what's the drawback when you do that?
What are the drawbacks to manually created connection objects? You're short-circuiting KCC. And as things change in your environment, as domain controllers reboot or are brought down, new ones brought in, KCC says, I can't do anything with this. So it may be an inefficient route. Delete them. All right? Okay, so I'm not making my point. There should be absolutely no manual created connection objects in sites and services. If there are, delete them. Let KCC do its job. Any other questions? All right. The MVPs wanted me to show you this new tool. It was just released on June 15th. The Active Directory Replication Status Tool. Essentially, download it, install it, and then by default, it's going to check the replication in your forest. Now, I've got 4 24-inch screen monitors, and there are so many columns in this thing, I couldn't even fit them in my display. So we've got, these are the left columns, the next set of columns, and as you see, it's just chunked. Then what you can do is double click one of the replication errors, and then it will then come up and tell you that, hey, the DSA operation is unable to proceed because of the DNS lookup failure, which is the issue I have with my hypervisor. They're always generating a new NIC every time a domain controller comes up, and it takes 45 minutes for it to actually do its thing. All right, next thing, subnets not defined. If you want a good logon experience for your users, this is one of the most critical ones. So why are subnets important? They help computers find the closest domain controller, and since Exchange is so prevalent in our world, they help Exchange find the optimal routing for messaging traffic. So how is a domain controller found? Now we're going to take a 30,000 foot view of this. If we were to actually go down and look at all the processes and all the contingencies and stuff, we'd be here for an hour just discussing this one process. So when a domain controller boots up, the net logon process will register SRV and A records. The A records, the IP address, the SRV records are telling it that it's a domain controller, that I can service LDAP, and here's my port. I'm a global catalog server, here's my port. I'm Kerberos, here's my port, and all kinds of other stuff. Then a client requests a DC by providing its site name to DNS. And then DNS uses the client site name to find a DC in that site or the closest site. And then DNS provides the IP address of a DC to the client. The problem comes in is if I'm a client and I've got an IP address that's not defined in subnets and sites and services, what happens? Well, I'm going to come up and I'm going to say, hey, my IP address is 172.16.1.1. And it's going to say, I don't see anything defined for 172.16. And it's going to say, are there any sites that are kind of closely related? No, I don't have any other sites closely related to that. So the next thing it's going to do is DNS will then say, okay, here is the information for every domain controller in your domain. If you've got 10 or hundreds, or if you're around the maximum of 1,023 domain controllers in a domain that Microsoft supports, all that information is sent to the client. The client will then gather all that information and then say, I need a domain controller. First one to respond wins. And I've actually had this happen. Client in Anderson, Indiana, had this happen. And all of a sudden, over in Shanghai, China, the intersite replication interval timer just happened to go off on a 56K dial-up lease line in Shanghai for a domain controller. That then came over and said, hey, I'm ready to replicate. And it said, oh, I'm a domain controller. I can handle this request. 863 group policy objects later, this domain controller is constantly sending down the stuff. They had 40-something logon scripts that had to come down. And then, because of this process, you get what's called domain controller affinity. So every time this client needed anything, it went all the way back to that domain controller in Shanghai, China over that 56K dial-up lease line. I don't know about y'all, but a dial-up lease line is billed by how often you use it. They didn't notice the problem until they got that month's bill for that dial-up lease line, which was absolutely outrageous to Shanghai, China. And of course, it never bothered them when the user kept saying, why does it take me so long to log in every morning? I don't know, everything looks fine here. So we go in and look, and what we find are that there are no subnets defined. So how do we find our missing subnets? Now, this is super secret information. You can only be told about this if you're a member of the Webster's Ultra Secret Society, or WUS. All right? So you're now all a member of my secret society, and I can tell you, there's this magical thing in Microsoft, in Windows, it's called event logs. Most people, and believe me, we're covering this because most people don't know that event logs actually exist. And if they know they exist, not allowed to look in the event logs. That's mysterious information. You're now a member of my secret society. You are now authorized to look in your event logs. You're authorized to actually look and open your system event log. And in your system event log, you're going to find an event that says, yo, in the last 4-point-something hours, I have serviced X numbers, a 179 client requests for authentication who are computers that don't have subnets defined in sites and services. I'm doing my job. I'm handling all the authentication requests for all 179. Oh, by the way, if you want to know who those 179 clients are, if you go look and see Windows debug netlogon.log, and if the file size is more than 20 meg, also look at netlogon.back. You'll see all kinds of wonderful information in there that you are now authorized to go in and find. So now that we have our netlogon.log, what do we do with it? We're going to open up Excel, go to Data, From Text, change the drop down to All Files, click Import. Now, this is my demo data. You're going to browse to see Windows debug netlogon.log for every domain controller. So if you've got a lot of domain controllers, you have to do this for every domain controller. Change this to delimited. Next, unselect tab, select space, click OK. Boom. There you are. Now, as the outside guy looking in, all I care about are the IP addresses. You may also care about client names. If so, you can reprocess this file and start looking at client names. If you're using IPv6, you can reprocess again and gather the IPv6 information. For 2008 and R2, I'm going to delete the first 4 columns. For 2003, I'm going to delete the first 5 columns. In other words, I'm going to delete everything up to the IP address. This step is not necessary. I just find it makes the output a whole lot easier to read. I'm going to select that column of IP addresses and I'm going to sort. Then I'm going to tell it to remove all duplicates, click OK, and then boom, in this live customer data, they had 5,444, 951 duplicate values found, 745 unique values remain. My record is for a large music company in Nashville where I had to load Excel 64-bit in order to load up all their netlogon.log files because they had more than 1 million entries in each one. So now we've got a decision to make. Do we need 1 subnet in site? Do we need 2 subnets in sites? Now this is, obviously this is all the sample data I can put in here. Do we need a subnet for 10.6? Or do we need a subnet for 10.6.0, 10.6.1? Yeah, don't know. Yeah, or you could just do 10. You know, who knows? It's your network. You have to tell me, you know, what your subnetting is. So once you have done that, now you're good to go. But you have decisions to make when you start looking through this data. And most people are surprised when they go out and look and they find out that they have got thousands and thousands and thousands of entries recorded in here.
So what are the 745 unique values? That's IP addresses?
Those are all individual IP addresses. On that music company I told you about, they had over 9,000 unique IP addresses. They had a lot of work to do. And they were wondering, they were suffering from slow performance, and I'll talk about them more because they're a good, bad example that I'm going to use later.
So are you going to give an example where to enter the IPs in sites and services?
That's just in sites and services. Go to subnets, right-click subnet, new subnet. Then it's up to you to do a 10/8 or 10.6/8/9/10, you know, whatever fits in your subnetting scheme for your particular environment. Every environment is different. Okay, before we leave sites and services. Oh, question.
Best way we look at the DHCP scope to see how they've broken that up?
If they've done that, yeah. Yeah. You'd be surprised how many people don't. You'd be surprised how many environments actually use static IPs for everything. Stupid. I mean, it's unmanageable. I don't know why they do that, but yeah. Yeah.
Once you have the subnets defined, do they just kind of do a latency test with the AD controllers to figure out what's closest? Because you're not going to have your AD controllers in your possibly in the same sites.
All right. Once you've got all your subnets defined, is his question, then what next? Well, you have to then attach those subnets to a site. And then in those sites will then be the domain controllers that can handle the authentication traffic for that range of IP addresses. And then DNS, because remember DNS is going to say, hey, here are all the domain controllers in the site. And then that client's going to say, okay, if you've got 5 domain controllers in that site, all right, 5 domain controllers, I need someone to authenticate me. The first one to respond wins. All right, before we leave sites and services. Up.
So once that's done, then when that same user logs on again, it defaults to that.
It will default to it, but then that domain controller will then say, oh, you're 172.16 and I'm 10.37. Oh, wait a minute, there's something else out here now for 172.16 here. You need to go to this domain controller. It will then go and say, oh, here are the domain controllers for the site that now, and it will then go and update that. That's all covered in the PDF because that's a lot more information. It gets very complicated, you know, when you go from one site to another site. What if I'm a new client with a new IP address that's not defined? You know, what if I move from one domain to another? How is all of that handled?
And how many domain controllers did the music company have?
How many domain controllers did the music company have? 5 functioning, 1 that had been powered off for over 6 months. Caused all kinds of issues. All right, there was a bug with all supported versions of XenApp and read-only domain controllers. When I was doing more research for this on all these global catalog and other slow logon issues, I actually came across a Microsoft article I'd never seen before that actually covered all the stuff about subnets and how do clients find domain controllers and how the global catalog affect everything. And what amazed me is there was one line in there that said, oh, if you're running XenApp 6 and you have only a read-only domain controller in your site, you will suffer from slow logons. The fix, add a read-write domain controller. I was like, doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose of having a read-only domain controller? So I then went to the CTP forum and said, hey, what's this? And what I found out is if you have an Active Directory site, and in that site you only have read-only domain controllers, and that site also contains any supported version of XenApp, you will suffer from slow user logons, which is not something we want. So the Microsoft article is here. It's very long. It's a great troubleshooting article. In the PDF, I'll also link to the other 3 articles that I found that Microsoft gives a lot of information on resolving slow logons. Citrix finally relented and came up with the CTX article discussing this. And there is a private fix, and they are working on making this private fix public. And everyone that I know that has put on this private fix said it has resolved the issue. All right, next thing we're going to look at are DNS reverse lookup zones. The links and everything will all be in the PDFs that you'll get immediately after the site. So now that we've done we have found all of our missing subnets. For each subnet we created in sites and services, a reverse lookup zone should be created. Now, Active Directory does not require reverse DNS. Active Directory will go on forever and ever, amen, if no reverse lookup zone is ever created. But if you're going to use Kerberos with XenApp, you must have reverse DNS. If you want a successful Xen desktop deployment, you will use reverse DNS. The first name resolution that Web Interface does, reverse DNS. And according to the vSphere 5 installation guide, you better have reverse DNS up and going. For the vCenter Server 5, you better have reverse DNS. To list reverse DNS zones, if you're on Server 2003, you'll need to install the Windows support tools. 2008, R2, 2012, this is built in. We're going to refer to this command several more times in the next couple of slides. But you will list this, and then it will list all your reverse DNS zones. You can then take that list of zones, compare it to what you have in subnets and sites and services. You need to reconcile the two. Any questions on reverse lookup zones. The next thing I want to look for, duplicate DNS entries. So how and why are unintentional duplicate DNS entries created? It may not surprise you, but a lot of places I go to, they'll have 100 PCs. And it's time to upgrade them. What do? Yank the power cord, unplug the patch cable, ship the stuff off to the recycler. They bring in 100 new, plug them in, go through the process, and now they've got 100 old AD accounts still in AD and still in DNS. Also, Zen Desktop, View, and other VDI solutions, every time they boot, DHCP. And you're going to get a new DNS record with the old one still in DNS. So, why is all that old crap out there? Because DNS aging and scavenging is not enabled by default, and you need to enable it. But if you're going to enable it, it has to be done in 4 places. It has to be done on the DNS server and the DNS server properties, and on your forward lookup zones, and on your reverse lookup zones. It has to be done in all 4 places, or you're not properly doing aging and scavenging. All right, so we're going to right-click our DNS server, set aging and scavenging for all zones, click the box, click OK, and then you're going to get this pop-up, which then says apply these settings to the existing Active Directory integrated zones. If you click it now, granted, most places I go to, replication is screwed up, DNS is screwed up, and so what happens when you do this and you click OK, it's supposed to go out there and apply, but sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, most of the time it doesn't. And you don't know if it has or if it hasn't. So we still got to manually check all of our forward and reverse lookup zones.
So before you do this, you should fix the replication.
Yeah. But fixing duplicate DNS issues can also keep replication from working. Then you're going to go right-click back on your DNS server, go to Properties, select Enable Automatic Scavenging. Scavenging period will change from 0 to 7 days. You click OK. Now, what about forward lookup zones? Well, we don't know which ones have automatically had aging and scavenging applied from that first one. So that DNS command we talked about, you're going to do DNS command, DNS server, /enum zones, /forward. It's going to present a nice, neat list of columns, 4 columns. The 4th column, you're going to look over on the far right. Any zone that does not have aging out to the far right, you need to go and right-click that zone, select Properties, Aging, enable it, click OK. The same thing for reverse. You don't know which ones. And there are, in most environments, far more reverse DNS lookup zones than there are forward. And so we're going to run that command, DNS server, /enum zone, /reverse. Get it, look on that last column, look on the far right, any zone that does not say aging. You need to right-click that zone, Properties, Aging, enable it, and click OK. All right, any questions on this? Oh, all right. I'm sorry? What is the length that's recommended? Microsoft says 7 is perfectly fine. That's why the default is 7. If you do it a shorter length, then you can cause the process to run too often. If you select a longer time, then you've got a chance for stale records staying out there, especially if you're implementing Zen Desktop, View, or anything like that. No.
So if you have a footprint microcontroller, you have DHCP and you change to something secure in 14 days.
He's saying, should this be coordinated with your DHCP server? Doesn't have to be, but if you want to keep everything consistent, because consistency really helps Active Directory. And there were another question.
Is there a certain inherent risk with setting up aging and scavenging?
No, there is not. Aging and scavenging will not touch manually created records. So if you have created A records, you've created CNAME records and so forth, those will never be touched because their TTL is 0. It's only going to look for dynamically added records. And it's only going to look for those that have been hanging around, not updated, for greater than this period. So if I'm constantly being refreshed, if my DHCP and I'm constantly refreshing and getting it, it's constantly updating that information in DNS. Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. And there was, someone else had a question? Nope. Okay. So, now how do we find our duplicate DNS records? Now, first thing I recommend is that you clean up your unintentional duplicate entries before you enable aging and scavenging. It's not necessary. It's not required. It's not mandatory. I recommend you do it because most people don't know what's in their DNS. This gives you a chance to go through DNS and clean up stuff. Like people who find DNS records for Citrix and ICA from their old MetaFrame XP servers from when they used the full program neighborhood client, and the IP addresses are no longer valid and the servers no longer exist in their environment. Gives you a chance to clean that stuff up. There is a manual cleanup process. In the PDF, I've got my 21 steps on how you can manually clean it up, or you can use the sweet creamy goodness of PowerShell. My friend Michael B. Smith has written a really nice script that will go through and find all your duplicates for you. So I'm going to run his script. I'm going to output it to a file called dns.txt. Then I'm going to open up Excel, data from text, find my DNS. I'm going to import it, change it to delimited, next, unselect tab, comma, finish, okay, there we are. And this lists all my duplicate names and also my duplicate IPs. You'll notice the row that my duplicate IP start on. That means for this live customer data, they had 2,638 duplicate host names. And there are almost 6,000 records, so there's about 3,400 duplicate IP addresses. Now, a word of warning, do not take this list of duplicates and just start deleting them all. We want to clean up unintentional. There are intentional duplicates. If you've got Exchange in your environment, you probably have DNS records for Exchange, Mail, Email, OA, OMA, AutoDiscover that are all going to be on this list. If you go out and just inadvertently delete all those records, you have just done what I called a resume generating event, and you will probably be walked out the front door. Another thing, this sample data had 16,000 records in it, which means I would have had to process it once to find all the duplicate host names, then I've got to process it again to find all my duplicate IP addresses. If you did it manually and you never blinked and you never made a mistake and you could do 2 records per second, you'd have to do 32,000 records. That'd take you about 5 hours if you made no mistakes and if you never missed anything. Michael's PowerShell script ran through it all in less than 5 seconds. 5 hours, 5 seconds, your call. Next thing I want to look for, Orphan domain controllers. So what are Orphan domain controllers? Orphan domain controllers are domain controllers that have just been unplugged, or they've died, or they're a VM that's been accidentally or maybe maliciously deleted. Or in the South, we've got tornadoes, hurricanes, fires, whole towns get destroyed. If I've got an F5 tornado coming down my street, I'm not going to bother with DC promo. So how do you spot an orphan domain controller? Remember, you're all members of my secret society now. Event logs, your system event logs, your replication event logs, your FRS event logs. All those event logs are screaming at you that we've got an issue here. And also if you run DC diag, it will report, hey, we've got issues here. I'm trying to pull in from this server and I can't find the server and I can't reach it and he's not talking to me. So how do you remove an orphan domain controller? Well, if all you've got are 2003 servers, Microsoft has a nice article with 20 steps that you can go through. I've done this a couple of 100 times. It takes me about 5 minutes. For most people, it can take them about 20 to 30 minutes to remove an orphan domain controller because there's a lot of steps that you got to go through. But it's very easy if you're on server 2008 or higher, or you have the 2008 plus RSAT tools installed. Now this is really complicated, all right? So you may want to take notes on this. You're going to right-click the Orphan domain controller in Active Directory users and computers, select delete, you're done. Now, do I need to repeat that? Because I know that's complex. Okay. Now, Orphan domain controllers, man, they're going to screw up KCC, they're going to screw up replication, they're going to screw up your computer startup, shutdown scripts, log on, log off scripts, I mean, you got Orphan domain controllers, you got a lot of issues in your environment. And that's going to affect your users. If it affects your users, it affects you. PDC emulator, not configured properly for time server. This is the biggie because time is critical. So what is the PDC emulator? We have 5 FSMO rows, 2 that exist in the forest, 3 that exist in each domain. The PDC emulator is the one, I know in Active Directory all domain controllers are equal. But in my opinion, the PDC emulator is the most equal of all domain controllers because that's, for this slide, that's where time is taken care of, and time is critical. Also, if a user changes a password, it automatically goes preferentially to the PDC emulator, so that if Brian fat fingers his user account and misses the password, goes to log on, the domain controller is going to go, oh, that's not the password I've got. It's not immediately going to deny the logon. It's going to go all the way over to the PDC emulator and say, hey, by chance, would Brian have changed his password? No. Okay, Brian, you screwed up. He tries a second time. He tries the third time. Says, screw you, I'm locking your account. That account lockout immediately goes to the PDC emulator to immediately be replicated out so that it's not a hacker trying to come in, trying to use Brian's account. We're going to lock that account out. So then when we unlock the account and the help desk then changes Brian's password to something that he can't remember, it's immediately going to go to the PDC emulator. So when Brian then goes to log in again, it's going to say, hey, has Brian changed the password? Yes, he has. Oh, here's the new password. Boom, Brian can now log in. So that is why, to me, the PDC emulator is the most equal of all domain controllers. The PDC emulator should be your most reliable, most stable, most highly available domain controller that you have. So how do you configure it? Microsoft has a really long article with all kinds of registry keys, but you only need, oh, Mr. Fix-It, he's kind of like me, he never works. You have 3 items, registry keys that must be configured properly. Type must be set to NTP and not ND5DS. The announce flags must be set to 5 and not A. And you have to set your external time server. Now, I recommend pool.ntp.org, and for the US, I use north-america.pool.ntp.org, 0x1. And if you don't append the 0x1, it's not going to work. Then you have to restart the Windows time service, or you can use PowerShell to do it. Now, you can do this via group policy. Create your group policy in your domain controllers OU. There's an article that my virtual friend Bob Free gave me a link to that shows you then how to use WMI filtering so that that group policy only hits the domain controller that has the PDC emulator row. So therefore, if you move the PDCE row to another server, the next group policy refresh, it automatically takes effect. And therefore, you don't have to worry about manually setting this stuff. So now that we've restarted, on the PDC emulator, you will now get 2 system event logs, which you can now see because you're authorized to look in the system event log. You're going to see the time provider is currently receiving valid time data from your external time source, and that it is now synchronizing. Then, using a Windows hierarchy, it's very detailed, a really nice big picture. It's linked to in the PDF. Once you've done that, then your other domain controllers will now say that they are now synchronizing the time source with your PDC emulator. And there's an entire hierarchy as to what all gets done and stuff. So, well, for me, it's pretty interesting. The next thing, domain controller DNS IP configuration settings. This is important because if it's not set up right, you're going to get DNS islands, and if you get DNS islands, you just broke replication, you break replication, you're going to break sysvol, you're going to break group policy, you're going to break DNS, you're going to have all kinds of issues because of this. Microsoft has an article that says this only applies to 2000. Not true. Applies all the way up to 2012. Because if you've got your domain controller stuff configured wrong, you're going to create DNS islands, you're going to break replication. So how do I usually find domain controllers configured for DNS? Like a big old bowl of spaghetti. We got two issues here. There's no consistency, and every domain controller is running DNS, which is not necessary. The next way I find them are intentional DNS islands. And that is where they have intentionally gone in and said, this domain controller will only look to itself for DNS and nowhere else. This is a fast way to break replication and break DNS. So how should it be done? Be consistent. Just pick a server, a domain controller. Now, I like the PDC emulator because it is your most reliable, most stable, most highly available domain controller. I like to pick it as my primary. Every domain controller will then point to it for primary. Then you're going to pick another server for secondary, and every domain controller will point to it for secondary. And then your primary and secondary will then point to themselves for their local loopback address for tertiary DNS. When you've got it configured this way, you can then run the Active Directory Best Practices Analyzer, and you will get a clean bill of health. Now, this gets a lot more complicated when you have multiple domains and multiple sites and domains that cross sites and sites that cross domains and stuff like that. It gets very complicated. So this is just our one domain, kind of one site type deal. What's wrong with this picture? Other than the domain controller's OU, there are no OUs. So if I'm going to implement, say, remote desktop servers, where are they going to go? By default, they're going to go in the computers container. What about all my users and security groups? By default, they're going to go into the users container. What can you not do on containers? Apply permissions or group policy directly. Why is it this way? Because most people, believe it or not, I'm covering this because most people fear OUs because they think OUs add complexity, and they fear group policies. You will not believe the number of places that do not use group policy other than the two default group policies that exist in Active Directory. So what are some guidelines? Microsoft recommends that we have one forest, that we have one domain, and you'll notice something missing. They don't talk about trees anymore. Trees add complexity. Microsoft no longer recommends trees. We're going to use OUs for management. Even when you're doing direct domain consolidation, forest consolidation, mergers and acquisitions, when you're moving, migrating forest from one to another, all those domains will become OUs in the target environment. Then you're going to use sites to control replication. Sites have absolutely nothing to do with security or permissions. Nothing. These 4 items will work for 99% of all environments, including hosted environments. So what do OUs give you? Delegation of permission and the proper application of group policy. Now here's just an example layout here. Just an example, every environment is different. Sometimes the desktop people will handle all the VDI stuff, and the server people will handle all the PBS stuff and XenApp and whatever other servers and stuff, because the desktop people don't want the server people telling them what to do, and so on and so forth. So, some vendor stuff. For Citrix, we got XenApp and XenDesktop Best Practices Guide. And then here we have XenApp and AD, and then XenDesktop and AD. Bottom line, Citrix says use OUs to segregate your worker groups, provisioning services, XenApp, XenDesktop, and other Citrix-related infrastructure servers. And for Quest, we've got these issues that Michelle Roth gave me the links to. And then res, I have Sander Vanderhoek from IBM. Gave me these. And all of these, including his copious notes for all of these bullet points, are in the PDF. And VMware View from Andre Leibovici, who VMware actually has a technical article, Troubleshooting AD Issues in VMware View, and that's what this comes from. So we've covered 10 solutions to keep failure away from your virtualization efforts. We're going to check your domain and force functional levels. You're going to get off of the defaults. You're going to make sure all domain controllers are global catalog servers, that we have no manually created connection objects. We're going to check the netlogon.log and netlogon.back files for our missing subnets. We're going to create our reverse DNS lookup zones. We're going to clean up DNS of unnecessary duplicates, clean up orphan domain controllers, make sure the PDC emulator is configured properly to be the time source, make sure all domain controllers have their DNS IP settings configured properly, and use Microsoft and other vendors' Active Directory design guidelines to make sure you get the best results. And I'm out of time for questions, but now the PDF is available on my website, and it's already live, so you can download it now if you want. And I thank you for coming.